Welcome to the channel, Mr. Nightmare Scares You. If you're new here, prepare for sleepless nights, and if you're already one of our subscribers, you know that what we're bringing you today will absolutely test all your limits. Before we begin the story, let's meet the person who lived through this terrifying experience. Kevin, 35, from Duluth, Minnesota, shared this story that will change the way you see the night. What happened to him on Christmas Eve wasn't just a nightmare. It was one of the most terrifying and disturbing encounters with Dogman ever documented. Scary stories and true accounts like this remind us that we are not at the top of the food chain. Stay until the end, if you dare. I used to love Christmas, the falling snow, the smell of pine, the feeling of security you get when you're in the comfort of your home. But all that's gone. Today, as December approaches, my stomach churns and my hands start to sweat. I can no longer sleep without the light on, and the idea of looking out a dark window in the middle of the night gives me panic attacks. I'm recording this account because I need to get this off my chest, as a way to vent. Most people think monsters don't exist, that they're just legends to scare children. I used to think that too, until that night. It was Christmas Eve. I was returning from a small gathering at a co-worker's house on the outskirts of town. The northern Minnesota region is unforgiving in winter. Temperatures plummet, roads disappear under thick layers of ice, and the surrounding forest seems to swallow everything. All you see is a sea of dead trees and absolute darkness. I knew the way by heart, but the weather was changing rapidly. A heavy blizzard began to form, and visibility dropped to almost zero. I drove slowly, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The radio was crackling, with no signal. I was completely alone, immersed in a void that was both white and dark at the same time. That's when the feeling of being watched began. It's something primal, an instinct we lose over time, but which awakens instantly when we are the prey. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but snowflakes being thrown against the glass by the biting wind. But my whole body was tense. The air inside the truck seemed heavier. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just fatigue and the tension of driving in the snow. But terror was already creeping down my spine. The darkness between the trees seemed to hide something massive, something that was following my vehicle along the invisible shoulder of the road. I was about 15 miles from the city limits. The car heater was on full blast, but I felt a chill coming from within, not from outside. The road was surrounded by gigantic pine trees that rose like black walls. That's when my truck's headlights illuminated something about 200 feet away. At first I thought it was a large deer, or perhaps a bear crossing the road looking for shelter. I braked slowly to avoid skidding on the black ice, feeling the tires struggle for traction. But as the car slowed, the creature didn't act like a normal animal. A bear would have continued walking on all fours, or perhaps stood up awkwardly. What was on the side of the road was already standing, supported on two legs, with a naturalness that turned my stomach. I stopped the car completely about 50 feet away. High beams shone directly on it. The air in my lungs disappeared. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't blink, I couldn't move a single muscle. Panic paralyzed me in a way I never imagined possible. He was colossal, easily over 8 feet tall. His fur was a dirty black, almost blending into the darkness of the forest, covering a body that displayed absurd and disproportionate musculature. His shoulders were broad like those of a bodybuilder, but his torso tapered to a thin waist, ending in legs that bent backward like the hind legs of a canine. His long, hanging arms ended in hands that weren't paws, but hands with elongated fingers and thick, sharp claws. And then he turned his head to face me. The shape of his skull was that of a monstrous wolf, but the expression was wicked, intelligent. He knew exactly what he was doing. Time simply stood still. His eyes reflected the light of my headlights, gleaming with a sickly yellowish hue. That gaze pierced the windshield and cut through my soul. There was no fear in it. There was only a cruel curiosity. He tilted his head slightly to the side, as if assessing how easy it would be to rip the door off my car. The fear I felt wasn't of an accident or a robbery. It was a biological horror, the absolute and sudden certainty that I was facing the pinnacle of predation, an abomination that nature should not allow to exist. I tried to force my foot back onto the accelerator, tried to tell myself to reverse and run away. But my body simply refused to obey my brain's commands. My mind screamed, but my limbs were frozen in a state of deep shock. The creature didn't make any sudden movements at first. It just stood there, allowing me to see every macabre detail of its anatomy, cementing that image in my head forever. The elongated snout displayed rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, exposed in something resembling a sadistic grin. His breath formed clouds of dense vapor in the icy air, proving that it was real, alive, made of flesh and blood. The wind outside shook the trees violently, but inside the car the silence was deafening. Only the frantic and painful beating of my own heart against my ribs. I was locked in a metal and glass box that offered no protection whatsoever against something of that size and strength. The Dogman, that terrifying legend I had heard about in campfire stories, was right there, blocking my path on the loneliest night of the year. Without taking his eyes off me, he took the first step toward the truck. The movement was fluid, almost silent, predatory. It was that movement that broke my paralysis. The survival instinct exploded in my chest. I gripped the gear shift with trembling hands and engaged reverse. I floored the accelerator. The engine roared, but the rear wheels merely spun in vain on the slippery ice, digging a hole in the accumulated snow. The vehicle slid sideways for a few feet, and the rear sank into the snowbank bordering the road. I was stuck. The truck wouldn't move. Despair violently overwhelmed me. I shifted into main gear and accelerated again, smoke and snow billowing from the sides, but it was useless. I only managed to sink the vehicle further into the icy embankment. My breathing was now rapid and labored, fogging the windows from the inside, worsening the already compromised visibility from the blizzard. I rubbed the glass with my sleeve, frantically trying to keep my eyes on the creature. He was closer now. Only 30 feet separated us. He walked with an arrogant posture, unhurried. Each step he took seemed to sink my heart a little further into my stomach. I checked the door locks repeatedly, pressing the button until my fingers ached, even though I knew those plastic locks wouldn't do any good. I desperately searched for my cell phone on the passenger seat. The screen glowed faintly in the darkness of the car. No service, not a single bar of signal. I was miles from any help, isolated in the extreme cold, surrounded by forest and hunted by a merciless monster. The immense being continued its approach until it partially moved out of the direct beam of the headlights, shifting into the driver's side blind spot. The dim dashboard illumination revealed the creature's black outline rising beside my window. My blood froze. The smell of rotting flesh and wet fur began to invade the car's ventilation system, an odor so strong and putrid that it made me instantly nauseous. It was the smell of death. The darkness outside my window was blocked by a solid mass. It lowered its enormous lupine head to look directly into the vehicle. I was huddled in the seat, pressed against the center console, trying to get as far away as possible from the thin glass that separated us. The creature's warm, moist breath fogged the outside of the window almost instantly. It raised one of its monstrous hands, and its claws scraped against the glass in a slow, calculated motion, scratching the icy surface and leaving clear marks in the condensation. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the glass to shatter at any moment, expecting those claws to tear my skin, and that this would be my lonely end in the middle of nowhere. His presence was overwhelming, a psychological pressure so intense that I felt my sanity slipping through my fingers. The feeling of powerlessness was total. I had no weapons, no way out, and no hope. He could end my life in a second if he wanted to, but he just stayed there, breathing heavily against the glass, testing my limits of terror. The monster was so close I could see the thick veins pulsing beneath the dark, leathery skin of its snout. Its breath continued to fog the glass, and panic gripped me so much that my vision began to blur at the edges. I expected the window to give way at any moment, sending lethal shards flying in all directions, but for some inexplicable reason, it halted its imminent attack. The Dogman took a single step back. It tilted its head again, as if disappointed by my complete lack of reaction, or perhaps assessing my fragility. With an agile movement that completely defied its colossal size, it spun on its heels and walked back to the tree line. In a matter of seconds, that mass of muscle and fury was swallowed by the impenetrable darkness of the forest. I was left alone, with the continuous sound of the wind battering the metal of my vehicle. My brain simply couldn't process the sudden truce. This wasn't a flight response or fear of the headlights. It was the behavior of an intelligent predator that knows its prey is completely cornered and has nowhere to go. It was toying with me, testing my psychological terror. The temperature outside must have been around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snowstorm was gaining disproportionate strength. I was stuck on the shoulder of an incredibly isolated road, on the edge of the vast and unforgiving Superior National Forest, a dense place where people disappear every year without leaving a trace. The pickup truck remained motionless and stuck. The reality of my situation began to weigh torturously on my shoulders. I had become a mere toy for something that defied all the laws of biology. The hope that a highway patrolman would pass by in the middle of Christmas Eve was statistically nil. To understand the true level of my despair, you need to understand the cruel geography of this northern region of Minnesota. The narrow road I was on was an old shortcut, an old logging route that stretched for almost 40 miles without any streetlights, gas stations, or residences along the way. I decided to take this terrible road to avoid the traffic and the likely snow-blocked lanes on the main highway. It was the worst and riskiest decision of my entire life. The gigantic trees here are extremely old, growing so close together that they form a claustrophobic and menacing tunnel over the asphalt. During the day, it's a beautiful landscape, but at night, under a violent blizzard, it transforms into a dark and deadly labyrinth. Inside the truck cab, the nauseating smell of old meat and wet fur emanating from the creature was still ingrained in the ventilation system, serving as a constant reminder that this hadn't been a hallucination caused by visual fatigue. My fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank. If I kept the engine running to use the heater continuously, I would run out of gas in a few hours. When the engine finally died, the temperature inside the vehicle would drop drastically, turning my truck into a frozen metal coffin in no time. I knew perfectly well that severe hypothermia would overtake me long before the first light of dawn. The feeling of isolation was absolute, dense and overwhelming. With each passing minute of agony, the snow piled up more and more against the doors, threatening to seal me inside. The tense silence that followed Dogman's departure was even more terrifying than his physical presence. I knew he was out there. The forest seemed alive and watchful, observing my growing despair, patiently awaiting the moment when the extreme cold or terror would finally destroy me completely. The air pressure was so heavy that my lungs burned with every shallow breath. It was precisely in that moment of profound and silent agony that a distant and vital memory surfaced in my troubled mind. About 2 miles back, long before the storm worsened and my encounter with that abomination, I had passed a small, abandoned maintenance shed used by highway department crews during the summer. It was a simple structure of thick bricks, most likely locked, but it offered solid walls, a roof, and perhaps heavy tools I could use to defend myself or materials to try and light an emergency fire. The idea of leaving the relative protection of the car caused me an uncontrollable physical attack of nausea. The mere thought of opening the driver's door and exposing myself directly to that icy darkness, knowing that the monster was prowling hungrily nearby, required a level of courage I wasn't sure I could muster. But the only viable alternative was to freeze to death trapped in the leather seat of my own vehicle. I began to prepare myself psychologically and physically for what would be, without a shadow of a doubt, the worst and most terrifying walk of my entire existence. I frantically donned every extra piece of clothing I found scattered in the back seat, layering thick winter coats, double leather gloves, and a heavy hat that covered my ears. Every movement was painfully slow and calculated, my eyes darting to every window of the car every second, hoping to see that animalistic face pressed against the glass again. I rummaged through the emergency compartment under the rear seats and found the lug wrench, a massive, heavy, and extremely cold iron bar. It was a truly pathetic weapon against an immense creature over 8 feet tall with claws as sharp as butcher knives. But it was all I had to grab and try to maintain some semblance of sanity. I also grabbed my tactical flashlight from the glove compartment, fervently praying that the batteries would withstand the harshness of the extreme cold. I placed my trembling hand on the door handle, feeling my heart pounding so chaotically it felt like it was about to tear my chest apart from the inside out. I would have to abandon my flawed fortress and step onto his territory. When I finally pushed open the metal door, the aggressive force of the wind almost ripped it completely from my weak hands. The frigid morning air hit my exposed face like a solid wall of ice bricks, immediately and violently stealing all the breath from my lungs. The accumulated snow was already more than 2 feet high on the side of the road, and I sank almost to my knees as soon as I placed both boots on the unstable ground. I closed the truck door with the utmost care and firmness, avoiding making the sound of metal clanging that might give away my exact position, although the constant wind should have muffled most minor noises. The scene around me had transformed into something out of an absolute and disturbing visual nightmare. The colossal pine trees bent dangerously under the excessive weight of the snow and the directional force of the wind, looking like long arms and black claws trying to stealthily reach me from the absolute darkness. I switched on my tactical flashlight with a swift movement, but the beam of white light revealed only the chaotic swirl of snowflakes cutting through the air ahead. The useful visual range was a meager 30 feet. The surrounding darkness seemed to actively swallow the artificial light, repelling any brightness. The hostile solitude of that environment was crushing to the human mind. I began walking in the direction I had come from hours before, closely following the edge of the trail to ensure I wouldn't get lost in the lethal labyrinth of trees. Each step was a physically exhausting struggle against the relentless nature. The deep, heavy snow quickly drained the energy from my legs, and the biting cold began to alarmingly numb the tips of my fingers. Despite the sonic intensity of the storm, the natural environment possessed a very specific oppressive quality, a dense and openly malevolent energy that hung in the air around me. I felt almost physically that the forest was not empty. The horrible feeling of being hunted and monitored, which I had previously felt protected by, was now 1,000 times stronger, brutally corroding my nerves. After what seemed like endless hours of agonizing walking, but which couldn't have represented more than 20 or 30 minutes of real progress, my flashlight illuminated a detail on the ground that made the blood run cold in my veins, in a way that the worst winter weather never could. The strong wind had slightly decreased in intensity for a brief moment, allowing me to see a strip of asphalt partially covered by a thin layer of snow, very close to the dark line of trees. Imprinted forcefully on the untouched white layer of the roadside were immense and frighteningly recent marks. Footprints. They didn't belong to an adult bear, and certainly didn't belong to any animal that biologists and modern science dare to recognize. They were monstrous, anatomical impressions, easily measuring about 15 inches from tip to tip, with extremely deep cavities where massive claws had pierced the hard ice to scrape the earth. The distance measured between each of the creature's steps was over 6 feet long, evidencing the colossal size of its body and the incredibly wide and powerful stride of that being. The most terrifying and devastating fact for my mind was not only the grotesque size of the footprints on the ground, but their calculated direction. They weren't pointing deep into the woods to get away from the road. They ran perfectly parallel to the asphalt, exactly in the same direction I was walking, trembling and vulnerable. The Dogman hadn't gone away and hadn't lost interest in me. He hadn't given up on his nocturnal prey. The monster was walking beside me, flanking me stealthily through the thick forest, completely hidden by the darkness, moving comfortably in the deep snow where I could barely crawl. The terrible realization hit my mental state like a blunt physical blow. He was consciously dictating the dark rules of that game. By not breaking my car window, he forced me to abandon my illusory protection, to expose myself to the brutal elements, and to exhaust my remaining energy on terrain where he held the absolute tactical advantage. He was hunting me patiently, building my psychological terror before the final strike. I froze in place, staring into the black abyss of trees just feet away, knowing he was watching me from that very darkness. The shock of seeing those immense footprints running parallel to the edge of the road hit me with the force of a blunt physical blow. I was there, exposed to the brutal elements of nature, battling against snow that was already over 2 feet deep, while it walked with disturbing ease through the dense forest. The Dogman wasn't just following me randomly, it was herding me in a calculated way. It was the ultimate predator, absolutely controlling every step I took in that inhospitable and desolate environment. Knowing that this colossal monster, with extremely powerful legs and claws capable of tearing through the steel of my car, was hidden in the shadows just a few feet away, transformed my walk into an indescribable and constant psychological torture. The darkness between the trees seemed to vibrate morbidly with its presence. I tried to keep the beam of my tactical flashlight pointed strictly ahead, but my eyes instinctively drifted to the dark line of the woods every second, desperately seeking any glimpse of that black fur mixed with the night. The temperature must have been around 0 degrees Fahrenheit now, and the extreme cold was beginning to severely affect my logical reasoning and motor coordination. Each time the wind blew more violently against my body, I imagined the impact as him advancing from the shadows for a lethal attack. I gripped the iron bar in my hand so tightly that my muscles ached deeply, even knowing that that inert piece of metal would be completely useless against the brute force of that abyssal being. He was undeniably toying with me, testing my maximum mental and physical endurance before deciding that the sadistic game was over. I needed to keep moving at all costs. Standing there, staring into the black abyss, was cowardly signing my own death warrant. I forced my exhausted legs to take the next step, sinking into the fresh snow, feeling the ice painfully seep into the edges of my leather boots. The extreme solitude of that logging route was absolutely suffocating. No one would pass by there in the dead of night. No one would come to save me from my fate. I was entirely on my own, fighting a battle that already seemed lost against a terrifying legend that walked silently beside me. With each step I took, the weight of my own body seemed to double. The thick layers of winter clothing, which should have protected me from the deadly weather, now acted as heavy, restrictive armor, demanding an absurd amount of vital energy that I simply no longer possessed. The air entering my lungs was so cold it felt like ground glass, tearing at my throat with each desperate breath. His presence was a constant, oppressive, and lethal force. As I crawled along the edge of the frozen track, my flashlight began to show the first signs of failure due to the extreme cold, the white light flickering intermittently and weakening alarmingly. The decreased visibility intensified my terror to almost unbearable levels, as absolute darkness was my hunter's main advantage. It was precisely when the light weakened that I began to hear the sounds of his movement within the woods. They weren't accidental noises of an animal trying to be stealthy, but intentionally heavy and violent footsteps of something that wanted to be heard, a constant audible warning that he maintained total control of the situation. The sound of thick branches being broken under the colossal weight of that monster echoed through the biting silence of the early morning, marking the exact rhythm of my funeral march. He walked on two legs with the same firm cadence of an extremely heavy man, but the distance between the impacts on the ground betrayed his height of more than 8 feet. Each time my flashlight threatened to go out completely, the pace of my steps in the forest seemed to accelerate sadistically, as if it were ready to leap the millisecond that total darkness took over. I tapped the base of the flashlight against the palm of my gloved hand, silently begging for the cheap equipment to endure a few more minutes of that torturous agony. The panic of going completely blind in the middle of that hostile forest made me quicken my pace recklessly, risking slipping on the thick layer of black ice that covered the exposed parts of the asphalt. The panting breath escaping my mouth formed dense clouds of vapor that reflected the weak light of the flashlight directly into my own eyes, further worsening my already restricted field of vision. The geographical isolation took its psychological toll, as I knew I was at least 8 miles from the nearest civilization. There were no natural shelters, no safe curves, only the endless corridor of gigantic pine trees lining the deserted road. The Dogman continued to flank me without showing any sign of fatigue, moving across the rough, snow-covered terrain as if walking on flat concrete. The cruelty of maintaining a calculated distance was his primary weapon of mental torture. He could easily have caught up with me and ended my life with a single blow the moment I abandoned the car, but his preference for prolonging my suffering indicated a level of malevolent intelligence that terrified me far beyond his monstrous physical form. The terror wasn't just the primal fear of violent death, but the visceral understanding that I was dealing with a predator who took absolute pleasure in the prolonged dread of his prey before the final kill. The psychological pressure of the journey increased dramatically when his behavior became more direct and overtly intimidating. He stopped simply walking parallel to me and began using the environment to demonstrate his immense strength and assert his territorial control. A heavy log, certainly weighing several hundred pounds, was hurled from the interior of the forest and landed violently on the edge of the road, a mere 20 feet in front of me, scattering a cloud of frozen snow in all directions. The impact on the ground made the earth tremble slightly beneath my boots. I froze instantly, my breath caught in my throat, inflamed by the cold, raising the iron bar to chest height in an utterly pathetic and desperate defensive gesture. The flickering beam of my flashlight illuminated the twisted, moss-covered wood that partially blocked my path. This was not an accident or a tree falling naturally due to the severe storm. It was a direct, physical warning that he possessed the power to crush me at any moment. The frigid air suddenly seemed to reek of the nauseating smell of decaying flesh and foul fur, the same indescribable odor that had invaded my car's ventilation system hours earlier. This meant he had drastically reduced the distance between us. He was dangerously close to the tree line, watching my horrified reaction to his brutal throw. I began to circle the fallen trunk with short, trembling steps, never turning my back on the section of forest from where the colossal object had been launched. The sensation of 2 yellow eyes piercing the darkness and critically assessing me sent violent shivers down my spine. The malice of the act was what paralyzed me most. He wanted me to know his strength and realize my complete futility in trying to resist. The wind carried strange sounds that didn't belong to the weather, tonal variations that seemed like deep, guttural vocalizations, so low that they vibrated directly in my chest instead of entering my ears. They weren't howls or barks, but complex noises that vaguely simulated the cadence of a dark, restrained laugh, the auditory expression of pure predatory sadism. The terror reached a new level of intensity, distorting my perception of time and space around me. Every mile I thought I had traveled seemed to multiply, transforming the road into an endless corridor of torment and absolute darkness. The extreme cold of Minnesota had already robbed my feet and hands of feeling, turning my limbs into heavy blocks of numb flesh that barely responded to the commands sent by my terrified and exhausted brain. When my hope was practically extinguished and my body was about to succumb to severe hypothermia and utter exhaustion, the darkness ahead revealed a detail that made my heart race frantically. Through the continuous swirl of snow and wind, about 500 feet away, the straight artificial outlines of the small road maintenance shed emerged like a beacon of salvation in the frozen inferno. The dark brick structure was compact and seemed abandoned, but it represented my only chance of survival against the lethal night and the monster that accompanied me. The glimpse of that rustic building injected an immediate wave of pure adrenaline directly into my bloodstream, momentarily clearing the fog of exhaustion that clouded my judgment. I instinctively altered my posture, my body leaning forward as my dragging walk began to transform into the start of an awkward and desperate run. However, the abrupt change in my behavior and pace did not go unnoticed by my merciless pursuer. The moment I quickened my pace toward the brick shelter, the heavy rhythm within the forest shifted aggressively. The Dogman instantly sensed my intention to seek safety and decided that the period of slow psychological torture had definitively ended. The sound of his movement ceased to be a menacing walk and became a swift and extremely destructive charge. The shifting snow and breaking branches multiplied terrifyingly, indicating that he was running parallel to me to cut off my escape route before I could reach the building's door. Raw panic took complete control of my motor actions. I abandoned any caution or attempt to conserve physical energy and began running with all my remaining strength across the slippery, ice-covered asphalt. The iron bar weighed heavily in my hand and swayed beside me as my arms pumped frantically against the biting wind. The 500-foot distance felt like an impossible marathon under those inhuman weather conditions. The terror of looking back and seeing that 8-foot-high black mass bursting from the trees and reaching me in the open sky forced me to focus my bloodshot eyes solely on the silhouette of the small building. The storm seemed to fight against my advance, throwing gusts of snow directly against my face and blinding me repeatedly, but I blindly trusted the fixed image of my final destiny embedded in my mind. The final race for my life had begun violently. The last 100 feet to the small shed were covered in a state of near unconsciousness induced by the brutal effort and overwhelming dread. The sound of the monster breaking through the tree line echoed terribly behind me. It had emerged from the forest and definitively entered the smooth asphalt of the road, abandoning stealth tactics and initiating direct, open visual pursuit. The nauseating smell of the creature completely swallowed the clean air of the snowstorm, indicating that it was mere steps away from my unprotected rear. I reached the building's entrance, sliding uncontrollably over the accumulated snow, my chest slamming violently against the heavy metal door with a painful impact that almost knocked all the air from my lungs. My hands, numb and clumsy from the 0-degree Fahrenheit cold, gripped the cold round metal doorknob in sheer desperation, and I tried to turn it aggressively. It was locked. The old lock was covered in a hard layer of ice, and rust kept the mechanism completely immobile. The scream of frustration and horror that tore from my throat was instantly lost in the deafening roar of the Christmas morning wind. The Dogman was advancing across the asphalt with a speed and aggression that defied the colossal dimensions of his muscular body, his cruel yellow eyes fixed directly on the vulnerable nape of my neck. I slammed the heavy iron bar against the frozen metal of the doorknob repeatedly, striking with the force of a cornered man who knows he has only milliseconds left to live on Earth. The accumulated ice shattered into sharp shards, and the rusty lock creaked agonizingly under the violence of the continuous impact. He was so close that his hot, fetid breath already touched the back of my neck, the heat emanating from that abomination melting the freshly fallen snow around us. With my last vestige of vital force, I kicked the base of the metal door with the thick sole of my boot, while simultaneously forcing the damaged doorknob down with all my body weight. The rusty door slammed shut violently with a loud, desperate metallic creak, throwing me uncontrollably onto the hard, dusty floor of the dark interior of the shed, at the exact same instant that the predator's immense claws scraped aggressively along the outer frame of the entrance. I landed awkwardly on the frozen concrete floor of the shed, the impact sending a wave of sharp pain through my knees and elbows. But the primal survival instinct completely ignored the physical trauma. Before I could even fully stand, I twisted my body on the floor and kicked the heavy metal door shut with all the brutal force my leg could still muster. The sound of metal hitting the iron frame coincided exactly with the moment the colossal mass of the Dogman, weighing over 800 pounds, slammed against the outside of the structure. The entire wall of the small brick shed trembled violently under the force of the impact, causing a thick rain of dust and ancient cobwebs to fall from the low ceiling onto my head. I pushed the rusty security latch, sealing the entrance at the exact millisecond that its immense claws began frantically scratching the exterior of the steel door, searching for a flaw to reach me. The sheer terror of being confined in a space of only 15 square feet with a furious monster trying to tear through the only barrier separating us was overwhelming to my exhausted mind. The darkness inside the building was total and absolute, so dense that I couldn't see my own trembling hands groping on the dirty floor for the tactical flashlight that had fallen during my desperate dive. The air inside was stagnant, smelling strongly of old motor oil and accumulated mold, but it quickly began to be contaminated by the putrid odor of death emanating from the creature outside, filtering through the crack in the door. It began to strike the steel sheet metal methodically and rhythmically, each heavy thud resonating like the beat of a funeral drum within that tiny-sounding board. The old hinges began to creak and protest agonizingly under the enormous force, the screw heads threatening to leap from the old wood of the doorframe at any moment. I knew the door wouldn't withstand that level of physical aggression for much longer. I crawled blindly across the rough floor until my numb fingers found the icy cylinder of the flashlight. I switched it on with my left hand, the weak flickering light cutting through the darkness and revealing the messy interior of the shed, filled with steel chains, empty barrels, and heavy maintenance tools. Gripping the iron bar with my right hand, I retreated as far as the space allowed, pressing my back against the opposite wall, awaiting the inevitable moment when the door would finally give way and my nightmare would enter to finish the dark hunt. The brutal assault on the front door ceased abruptly, replaced by a sudden, dense silence that was even more terrifying than the continuous impact of the battering metal. My chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, the condensation fogging my already limited vision, obscured by the dim light of my flashlight. I viscerally realized that the monster hadn't given up the attack. It was merely shifting its predatory strategy, assessing the structural vulnerabilities of my small brick refuge. The heavy sound of its paws sinking into the accumulated snow around the building indicated that it had begun to circle the structure slowly and deliberately. The maintenance building had only two small ventilation windows in the side walls, positioned about 7 feet above the ground, both protected by a rudimentary iron grate. I directed the flashlight beam toward the window closest to my right, observing the dirty, ice-encrusted glass with a manic and terrified attention. The nocturnal air of that Christmas night swept through the exterior with fury, but my attention was completely fixed on the small rectangular opening. It was then that the light from my flashlight reflected back onto something positioned outside the window. A dark, furry mass completely blocked the meager light provided by the snowstorm, and a gigantic eye with a yellowish iris and an incredibly dilated pupil appeared in the crack between the rusted iron bars. It was looking directly into the shed, examining the dark surroundings with a sharp and terrifying intelligence. The height of the window indicated that it was comfortably perched on its hind legs, only tilting its monstrous head to inspect its trapped prize. The exchange of glances lasted an indescribable and torturous eternity. The malice reflected in that yellow iris was not that of an irrational wolf searching for food, but that of a sadistic entity, relishing the peak of my human despair. He blinked slowly, his thick eyelid drooping over the gleaming orb with arrogant calm. Then one of his massive hands, equipped with inch-long claws, gripped the window bars. The creature's arm muscles flexed and tensed with brutal force, and I heard the terrifying sound of iron beginning to twist and dried cement cracking around the anchors. He was tearing the bars from the wall with the strength of a single arm, testing the building's integrity like peeling a fruit. The realization of my own fragility reached a level bordering on madness. The line between sanity and utter panic dissolved, leaving only the raw, violent understanding that I would be torn apart inside that forgotten masonry tomb. When he realized that the small side windows were too narrow for his colossal body to pass through, and that breaking the solid brick would require unnecessary effort, the ultimate predator altered his tactical approach once more. The sound of the bars being forced shut, and I heard the heavy, agile noise of his claws digging into the side of the building. The Dogman was scaling the frozen brick wall with grotesque ease for something weighing as much as a giant grizzly bear. The impact of his landing on the shed roof sounded like a pickup truck crashing directly into the structure's ancient wooden beams. The corrugated metal roof and internal support structure groaned violently, buckling under the extreme load of over 800 pounds shifting above. Dust accumulated over decades rained down on me intensely, forcing me to close my eyes and hold my breath to avoid coughing in the sepulchral silence I was trying to maintain. The flashlight revealed the dust dancing in the stagnant air as I watched in terror as the sagging ceiling gave way inch by inch with each heavy step he took on the roof. The 15-square-foot interior space seemed to shrink around me, the claustrophobia increasing with each creak of the weakened wood. He paced back and forth above my head, frantically sniffing the air for the exact location where I was cowering on the cold floor. The psychological pressure of this aerial siege was a refined and relentless torture. Knowing that an abomination with canine hind legs, giant shoulders and razor-sharp teeth was literally inches from my head, separated only by thin sheets of tin and rotting beams, was enough to induce a heart attack. The 0-degree Fahrenheit cold that permeated my clothes was completely forgotten, replaced by a cold, viscous sweat that ran down my back, soaking my shirt beneath the winter layers. The sound of continuous scraping claws, sweeping the snow from the metal roof, echoed in the darkness, searching for any crack or weak point in the structure. He stopped exactly above the spot where I was crouched against the cold wall. I paralyzed every muscle in my body, holding my breath until I felt the veins in my neck throb with pain and lack of oxygen. The roof gave way with a long, agonizing crack, and the rusty metal blade bent dangerously, revealing the direct pressure of his hind paws on that spot. He was testing the roof to get in from above, planning to transform that small safe haven into the perfect death trap, closing the lid on my own coffin before descending to reap my life amidst the terror and darkness of that cursed night. The vertical assault began with a terrifying and unthinkable brutality for my mind, already on the verge of complete collapse. The central beam of old wood, which supported most of the fragile roof of that rudimentary shelter, simply gave way under a sudden and colossal blow directed from above. The sound of the wood violently splitting in two was deafening in the confined space, similar to the sound of a ship's mast breaking in a severe storm. The roof partially collapsed, sending an avalanche of sharp metal tiles, rotten pieces of wood, thick snow, and frozen debris directly into the center of the dark room. I instinctively threw myself back against the wall of the main door the instant the structure fell, narrowly avoiding being crushed by the collapsing rubble. The gap in the roof exposed the black night sky and allowed the snowstorm to relentlessly invade the interior of the shed, but the true horror was what descended through this new opening. A monstrously long, dark arm, covered in a tangle of stiff, damp fur, surged through the crack with lethal speed. The creature's hands were disproportionately large, its elongated fingers ending in curved, scythe-like claws, easily measuring 4 to 5 inches of pure dark bone. It began to blindly sweep the air inside the shed, its furious panting breath snorting through the hole in the ceiling as it desperately tried to grab me in the darkness. The concentrated smell of wet fur and putrid breath filled the small space suffocatingly. The beast's hand grazed inches from my face as I recoiled, flattening pathetically against the rough, frozen brick wall, my entire body trembling in convulsions of utter fear. It thrashed the air several times, destroying some metal shelves fixed to the upper walls and scattering heavy tools across the cement floor as if they were mere plastic toys. The beam of my flashlight trembled uncontrollably, randomly focusing on the brutal movements of that gigantic creature, exploring every square inch of the ceiling in search of my flesh. Desperation made my hands grip the heavy iron bar with extreme, supernatural strength. The sharp claw tore the side of my thick winter coat in one of the predator's blind movements, cutting through the jacket's resistant fabric with the same ease as it would cut through rotten cloth, tearing a short, muffled scream from my parched throat. The slightest touch from that creature emanated immense force, clearly demonstrating that any firm, direct contact would result in my instant and violent death by dismemberment in the middle of that dusty, icy floor. I cowered even further, a grown man reduced to the purest state of prey, cornered by death itself. The confrontation reached its most insane level of physical and psychological terror when the monster wedged its 2 front paws into the tattered edges of the broken roof and tried to force its colossal torso, nearly 4 feet wide, through the tight opening. The creature's strength tore and warped the zinc roofing with astonishing ease. I saw the Dogman's long snout break through the shadows of the roof and enter the intermittent beam of my flashlight. Its receding lips exposed asymmetrical, perfectly shaped rows of sharp, lethal fangs, dripping thick saliva in my direction. The expression of raw malice and primal hatred was etched into my mind for all eternity. However, the beams and upper steel reinforcement of the wall structure blocked its disproportionately broad shoulders, and the narrow passage began to squeeze the monster in an unwanted way. In a final, inexplicable surge of blind fury, fueled purely by the deepest instinct for self-preservation, I lifted the heavy steel bar I held with both numb hands and delivered a swinging blow, using the absolute residual force of my despair against the side of the arm, sweeping the space below it. The dense, brutal, metallic impact reverberated painfully through my exhausted arms, as if I had struck the rigid trunk of a centuries-old oak with a pure iron instrument. The abomination's rigid, muscular mass absorbed the massive mechanical shock almost entirely, but the surprise of prey, retaliating so aggressively in the midst of climax, seemed to shatter the predator's presumptuous expectation. It showed no pain or any sign of weakness. Instead, the creature produced that distorted, guttural sound, an extremely deep and menacing vocalization that vibrated throughout the entire room before recoiling its long arm outward and violently pulling its yellowish snout out of the crack in the shattered roof. I remained with my arms outstretched and the trembling iron bar raised in the cold air, staring fixedly at the black square that revealed the ferocious storm, my chest throbbing so hard it felt like my heart would burst through my ribs. I remained paralyzed in that exact state of futile readiness and extreme horror for countless minutes, waiting for the door to be obliterated or for the walls to finally give way to the weight of that apocalyptic being. But the only thing that returned was the incessant wind and the gentle movement of snow falling through the hole opened in the structure. The tense silence that followed confirmed my isolated confinement. I survived the breaking point and the ultimate encounter with lethality and horror that a human being could endure, drowned in the darkness of an endless night and at the mercy of a true natural demon. The hours that followed the creature's brutal retreat were, without a doubt, the darkest and most psychologically devastating period of my entire existence on Earth. The silence that returned to the interior of the small maintenance shed was heavy, oppressive, and laden with the constant promise that death still lurked within the frozen brick perimeter. Through the torn opening in the twisted metal ceiling, the relentless Minnesota blizzard continued to dump flakes of ice directly onto the concrete floor where I huddled. The ambient temperature had already plummeted to well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and the biting wind transformed the shelter's interior into a veritable masonry freezer. I remained completely still in the darkest corner of the room for what seemed like decades of utter agony, gripping the heavy iron bar with both hands, though I no longer had the physical strength to deliver a second blow should the monster decide to return to finish the job. My body had entered a state of profound shock. The violent tremors that initially shook my shoulders gave way to a dangerous and lethal numbness that began to creep up my feet and hands, indicating the initial stage of severe hypothermia. The absolute terror that the Dogman was merely waiting outside, patiently letting the extreme cold do the dirty work for him, gnawed at my mind and destroyed any remaining hope of salvation. Every time the wind whistled through the broken tiles or the wooden structure creaked under the excessive weight of the accumulated snow, my heart skipped a beat, firmly believing it was the sound of his immense claws testing the walls again. I didn't dare move a single muscle, didn't dare blink, and often held my breath until my lungs burned with pain, desperately trying to catch any sound of heavy footsteps crushing the ice outside. The absolute darkness of that Christmas night seemed to stretch on endlessly, warping my perception of time and creating terrifying hallucinations in the shadows of the tools scattered on the ground. The still image of the yellowish snout descending from the ceiling, accompanied by that putrid and indescribable smell of death and wet fur, repeated itself in an endless cycle of nightmare projected directly into my open eyes. The feeling of total powerlessness and absolute vulnerability before a primordial and relentless force of evil nature shattered my mind in a way that no normal human trauma could. I was simply passively waiting for my life to be extinguished, delivered to the icy abyss and crushing solitude. Dawn arrived without brilliance or warmth, but rather as a slow and painful transition from total darkness to a pale, ghostly grey that began to seep through the shattered crack in the roof. The snowstorm had finally lost its violent intensity, leaving a trail of destruction and absolute silence over the forest surrounding that old, isolated road. When the faint light of Christmas morning illuminated the interior of the shed, the extent of the physical damage caused by the Dogman's onslaught became terrifyingly clear to my exhausted eyes. The corrugated metal and upper support beams were bent and torn, with a force that defied logical comprehension, as if a heavy industrial machine had tried to crush the structure from top to bottom. Trying to get up from the dirty cement floor was an excruciating physical battle. My joints felt as if they had been fused together by the extreme cold, and the pain that radiated through my legs and back was so sharp that I almost fell to my knees again. My leather gloves had frozen around the surface of the iron bar, requiring me to pull my hands away with brute force to free myself from my only weapon of defense. I walked trembling and unsteady to the heavy steel main door, which still displayed the deep dents and severe scratches inflicted by the monster's claws. I pressed my numb ear against the icy metal, holding my breath for long, agonizing minutes, listening intently outside for any noisy breathing or stealthy footsteps. Only the oppressive stillness of the frozen morning responded. With a monumental effort, I forced the damaged lock to turn and pushed the rusty structure open, battling against the immense barrier of accumulated snow that had formed during the early morning hours. The cold morning air hit my face like an invisible blade, but the scene that unfolded before me solidified the terror that would haunt my mind for the rest of my life. The ground around the small building was completely overturned. The monster had circled the structure multiple times, leaving colossal depressions in the deep ice. The massive footprints, easily measuring those incredible 15 inches in length that I had noticed earlier, wound around the walls and converged on the exact point where it had propelled its entire mass onto the shelter's roof in a single leap, impossible for conventional biology. Watching the trail receding and disappearing deep into the impenetrable interior of the tree line, I understood that it hadn't been repelled by my pathetic defense. The Dogman had simply decided the game was over, sparing my existence for reasons that completely escape human rationality. The walk back, along the icy roadside toward the main highway, was a dissociative trance driven solely by my body's instinctive refusal to shut down. The snow piled up on the road was over 3 feet high in several sections, forcing my battered body to exert an absurd and painful effort to advance a few inches with each attempt. When I passed the exact spot where I had abandoned my truck hours before, I saw that the vehicle was almost entirely buried under a giant white mound, its dark bodywork unrecognizable under the relentless storm, the side window still bearing the invisible memory of the fetid breath and claws that had initially tested my sanity. I ignored the buried car, knowing that seeking shelter there again would only be returning to my own abandoned tomb. I continued dragging myself along the hidden asphalt, my brain fragmented by exhaustion and severe tension. My perception of the surroundings wavered dangerously, the line of shadowy trees always seeming to shelter the gigantic shadow of that colossal being following me along the edge of the forest, my eyes perceiving imminent threats where the wind moved ice-covered branches. After traversing approximately 3 miles of excruciating physical suffering, the distant, muffled sound of a heavy engine broke the acoustic isolation of that forgotten route. The rotating orange light of a large county snowplow emerged from the grey morning mist, slowly advancing down the road and clearing a path through the extreme obstruction of the roadway. When the experienced driver finally spotted my pathetic figure staggering almost lifeless across the center of the uncleaned asphalt, he slammed on the brakes, skidding several feet before stopping the large yellow metal machine. He quickly opened the door and rushed toward me, the expression on his face shifting from genuine shock to urgent concern as he observed my calamitous state. My heavy-duty coat was torn and stained with dirt, my face was marked by utter terror and the initial frostbite, and my empty eyes couldn't focus on the man's friendly face. He quickly guided me to the revitalizing and immediate warmth of the official vehicle's cabin, asking dozens of worried and frantic questions about where my vehicle was and what had happened to me in such extreme weather. I couldn't articulate a single comprehensible syllable. The trauma hermetically sealing my throat, the panic silencing my voice and my ability to narrate the impossible and abysmal truth of what had haunted me during the early morning hours. The slow recovery process at the city's regional hospital was accompanied by constant, suffocating mental torture that never left my subconscious. Physically, I was diagnosed with severe hypothermia and the beginning of moderate frostbite on my hands and feet, but the bodily damage was superficial compared to the irreparable damage done to my psychological state and my perception of reality. When officers from the local police department came to my room to file a report and try to understand why I had abandoned my safe vehicle and ventured out on foot into a brutal blizzard that nearly claimed my life, lying was the only answer my terrified brain could formulate and present. I spoke of having lightly collided with a snowbank, invented that a huge, abnormally behaving black bear had emerged from the tree line, aggressively surrounded the vehicle, and forced my panic, describing the event with a calculated desperation to hide the true abomination. The experienced police officers nodded understandingly, explaining that acute hunger and harsh winter weather conditions can drastically alter the behavioral patterns of large wild predators in the region. They accepted the bear's story without deep questioning, relieved by a rational explanation, but I know with absolute and devastating conviction that there was no biological rationality or scientific explanation for the creature that walked bipedally with the arrogance of a demon, possessed the cold intelligence of a human serial killer, and carried the destructive and colossal force of an incarnate nightmare. The true and permanent scar is not etched on my hospital-healed skin, but carved deep into my constant nightmares, which wake me every morning drenched in cold sweat and dominated by paralyzing panic. I had to move into an apartment in a densely urban and brightly lit area, obsessively locking all the doors and barricading the heavy windows, because any sound from the wind scraping against the exterior of the buildings or any strange, dense smell invading the central ventilation system triggers my extreme terror, bringing the yellowish snout and lupine eyes back to the forefront. The reality inhabited by normal people is merely a thin layer of comfortable illusion designed to mask the true abyss that exists just beyond the end of the illuminated and civilized asphalt. Many people spend their entire lives firmly believing that we are at the absolute and unquestionable top of the food chain, that the dense forests and isolated roads belong to the safe domain of modern man, illuminated by the powerful headlights of our metal cars. But I learned in a violent and unforgettable way that the ancient, deep and hidden forest does not belong to us and never has belonged to us at any point in our history. There are primordial horrors, ancient and predatory abominations that walk in the remote areas of the Americas, colossal and intelligent beings that only tolerate our fragile presence when they decide that hunting is not necessary. Frightening stories, forgotten legends, and real accounts of encounters with Dogman are not mere inventions to scare away curious onlookers from ancient properties, but rather desperate testimonies of survivors who had the astonishing misfortune of peeking behind the curtain of reality and facing the dark and cruel apex of terrestrial predation. I'm merely a man whom the monster chose to spare after shattering my spirit into 1,000 tiny pieces on the lonely Christmas Eve in Minnesota. And I write this painful account as a definitive warning to all those who travel along the dark edges of unfamiliar highways when the sun completely disappears from the horizon. If you feel the temperature plummet abruptly and catch that terrible, nauseating smell of decaying flesh and wet fur emanating from the invisible line of trees, never leave the interior of your vehicle under any circumstances, for it is watching with its large, cruel, yellowish eyes, assessing your exact level of terror before the first merciless attack. The horror story told today is absolute proof that legends lurk right beside our civilized and enlightened world. And if this true story made your blood run cold, you're in the right place, because the sleepless nights have only just begun. Thank you so much for following this account on your favorite YouTube channel. Mr. Nightmare Scares You. Your support strengthens our journey through the shadows of the unknown and brings to light the most terrifying and mysterious encounters ever documented. If you survived until the end of this tense video, don't forget to leave your like to support the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss the next real stories, and activate the notification bell to be notified whenever true terror appears here. Share this video with that brave friend of yours and leave in the comments, what would you do if you encountered the Dogman on the road? Remember to always lock your doors securely before going to sleep. And until our next encounter with the nightmare,